Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the 7th session of ARCS Forward and the National Scholar Speakers Series. It's nice to see so many faces. Thank you all for being here. I am Ellie Nesbitt, member and co-president of ARCS Metro Washington chapter, and I will be moderating our session today. In case you don't know, ARCS stands for Achievement Rewards for College Scientists. ARCS Foundation is a women-run organization. Its mission is to advance science in the United States by providing financial awards to academically outstanding U.S. citizens studying to complete degrees in science, technology, engineering, and medical research. I have been a member of the ARCS Metro Washington chapter since 2010. I have a BS in chemistry and an MS in chemical engineering, and I joined because I found the mission to be very compelling. Since then, I have found myself continually impressed by the scholars. Our chapter scholars are nominated by our 5 partner universities in the Metro Washington area, and their cutting-edge research. I'm also always thrilled to work with my enthusiastic fellow members who support the ARCS mission and who bring such outstanding expertise from their many diverse backgrounds. I invite all the viewers today to learn more about ARCS and consider the possibility of becoming a member in one of our 15 chapters around the country. You're already aware of our Metro Washington chapter, but please visit our website at arcsfoundation.org to find a chapter in your area. During our ARCS Forward session today, we will be learning about autonomous vehicle research from 2 ARCS scholars. Eddie Andert is from the Phoenix chapter, and Trent Weiss is from the Metro Washington chapter. There will be a Q&A session after both scholars have presented. These ARCS Forward sessions have covered a wide range of STEM topics. The ARCS Forward National Scholars Speaker Series was created to inform our audience about science topics that are relevant and interesting to both science and non-science people, and to introduce scholars from across the ARCS chapters to our members, donors, and friends, and to other scholars working in related fields. I can tell you that planning for ARCS Forward spring sessions is underway. The scholars we have lined up are doing some amazing research and exploring 2 great topics. 1, the genetic relationships in the human body that are truly surprising, and 2, the fragility of the open ocean and some of the creatures living in it. You won't want to miss out. On behalf of the ARCS Forward Committee, thank you for joining us today. As you listen to the speakers, please feel free to enter questions into the chat. Again, there will be time for Q&A at the end. Please welcome Trent and Eddie.
All right, so I'll go ahead and share my screen. So for everyone who doesn't know me, I'm Trent Weiss. I'm an ARCS scholar with the Metro Washington chapter. Center view. Okay, can everybody see my screen? Good deal.
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay. So I'm Trent Weiss. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Virginia under advisement by Dr. Madhur Bell. And I'm going to talk to you about achieving safe autonomy through speed and agility. So, from a high level, how do we make sure that the autonomous vehicles can achieve safe behavior, even when encountering unexpected situations that are not part of day-to-day driving? And there's kind of 2 high-level approaches. One is kind of the brute force Google car approach of just drive millions upon millions of miles and hope you capture whatever edge conditions you could ever hope to capture within those millions of miles of training data. And the other falls generally into a class of what's called formal methods, which is attempting to reason about system behavior based on some assumed model of how the system works. And this works okay for very specific scenarios, but these assumptions are often far too simplistic to generate any kind of broad guarantee. And my approach sits somewhere in the middle, and it's what we like to call safety through agility, where we focus squarely on the edge conditions and hypothesize that if we train an autonomous system purely on these unexpected edge conditions, that it will overall be safer than a vehicle that has never seen them or is trained on only very, very few of these edge conditions. So my kind of high level research hypothesis is, how do we operate autonomous systems at the very limits of what they're capable of? And I'm researching how to learn to drive autonomously in high-speed racing situations. So yes, we talked about edge conditions, and what we really mean by that is kind of unexpected or highly dynamic and uncertain environments. Usually this comes across as an unexpectedly high speed or high relative acceleration between the autonomous vehicle and those that are around it. So we're talking about things like this, right? Where stuff where all of a sudden a car in front of you cuts you off, or if it slams on the brakes, or if the drunk driver behind you decides he's going to be a race car driver for the next 20 minutes. Things that are that happen every so often, but when they do happen, it's absolutely critical that the autonomous vehicle handles them appropriately. So these things are pretty uncommon, and so you should ask, where do we find them, right? Like even if we have millions upon millions of miles of Google car style training data, how do we focus specifically on these kind of unexpected situations? And my research uses motorsport as kind of the general test case for how do we push systems to their very limits and encounter these edge conditions all the time. You could say there's really no such thing as day-to-day racing, right? Like if you drive a race car, on the racetrack the same way you drive to the grocery store, you're going to lose the race, right? The entire race is nothing but edge conditions. And it looks kind of like this, right? Not totally dissimilar from the video we saw earlier, but the thing is, these drivers are doing it on purpose, right? They're doing this all the time for the entire race. So I'm going to use a data gathering strategy that sits firmly in the corners and firmly in the edges to ensure we can handle these kinds of unexpected situations. And to do that, we're going to utilize, video games. Actually, we realized decades of research in physics and graphics realism that the industry has put into racing video games to provide a very low risk environment for these kinds of high speeds testing, right? So if we crash a car in the video game, it's not a big deal, right? And one of my first publications was wrapping this into what we call the deep racing AI framework, where we have a fully closed loop development environment for autonomous racing, along with the some bindings to a very popular meta operating system that the robotics community uses to kind of develop and deploy these algorithms. And so we have this simulation environment, right? We can generate theoretically unlimited training data, right? So we're all kind of set up to do end-to-end machine learning based control, where you just take images of the driver's point of view and train a neural network to map those to control values for the car, steering, throttle, and brake. And people do this, right? So there's this very, very famous paper from NVIDIA called PilotNet, where they trained a neural network to map images of the driver's point of view to steering angle. And the bottom right of the video is a little difficult to see, but in this particular one, he's going a whopping 9 miles an hour, right? So as long as you stay at relatively low speeds and stay in the stable region of an Ackermann dynamic model, this works okay. As long as you don't look at it too mean or breathe on it too hard. But I'm of course going to ask the question, what if we push this thing faster, right? Again, if everything seems under control in a racing environment, you're not going fast enough, right? So as it turns out, if you try to deploy this kind of thing in a racing situation at upwards of 100 miles an hour, it looks kind of like this, right? These neural network based machine learning control algorithms tend to break down at really, really high speeds, where mistakes made at 150 miles an hour are catastrophic, right? So you can't really get away with kind of the wobbling setup you saw in the earlier video with PilotNet. So we need something else, right? And the kind of one way to do this is, instead of mapping images directly to control values, you can instead map images to a sequence of waypoints that the car needs to follow, and kind of leave the control problem to a classical control algorithm that's already been solved, right? Given a path the car needs to follow, just follow it with some sort of model predictive controller or your favorite state-of-the-art control system. So how do we represent trajectories, right? One way is just with a sequence of waypoints, but this definitely has its drawbacks, right? So in a task space of just a two-dimensional flat plane, you need n times 2 parameters to represent a trajectory, which is a very high dimensional space, and this kind of tends to suffer from the classic cursive dimensionality. So we've also done this, right? If we take this kind of system and train a machine learning algorithm to map images from the driver's point of view to a sequence of waypoints for the car to follow, you get results that look a little bit like this, right? Works okay, but you tend to cut corners, right? Not going to cut it for actually running a race. So how do we kind of cure this cursive dimensionality problem? And my approach uses what's called Bezier curves, which is a very low dimensional space of trajectories, where we represent curves as just a linear combination of Bernstein polynomials to have a trajectory that can be specified by only a very few set of coefficients called control points. And somewhat poetically, these curves were actually developed by a man named Pierre Bezier, who made them to model race car bodies. So kind of meant to be in this context, right? And when we do that, we get a pretty significant improvement, right? If we use this very low dimensional space to represent trajectories, you can get behavior that's nice and smooth, nice and stable. We can run a race all around the Australia Formula One racetrack without crashing, and we actually achieve a pretty good lap time. We hit somewhere around 1 minute and 40 seconds, which sounds pretty fast, but the pros are typically faster than 1 minute and 30. Right? So if you kind of recall the way I approach this problem, how do we go faster, right? Like, we're not going fast enough, right? Like, if we have a nice, smooth, stable controller, we haven't pushed it hard enough to find where it really breaks down and it really fails. So if you do that, if you just take our predicted Bezier curve and just push it to go faster, you get behavior that looks a little bit like this, right? Not optimal, right? Clearly, we've exceeded the dynamic limits of what this vehicle is capable of, right? Because up until this point, we've just been doing behavioral cloning, right? We've just been saying, how do expert drivers drive, and attempt to just emulate that with a machine learning model. But that only gets you so far, right? You're at the limits, or you're at the mercy of whatever training data you have. So we need a different approach, right? We need to actually specify racing in a way that's unambiguous and is guaranteed to have the properties we want it to have. Basically, we need to get around the track as quickly as possible, but don't violate the boundaries and don't violate any dynamic constraints of the car. For me, I just use centripetal and lateral acceleration as my dynamic limits. But any model of what you want to do to represent the limits of the car is applicable in my approach. Basically, we need to drive fast, but don't crash, right? So to do that, we're going to use not just kind of point estimate Bezier curves that pop off this neural network, but we're going to instead use those curves as the mean of what's called a probabilistic Bezier curve, where we treat each predicted curve as the mean of a set of mutually independent Gaussian distributions. So you can think of probabilistic Bezier curves as just a distribution over the space of trajectories. Most importantly, it's a distribution over the space of very, very low dimensional Bezier curves, for which probabilistic inference is now suddenly tractable. Where if in our previous approach, if we had hundreds and hundreds of waypoints, attempting to do any kind of Bayesian estimation over such a high dimensional parameter space would just be totally intractable. And so we're going to treat this curve as the mean of a Gaussian prior, and we're going to combine that prior with a likelihood function that's kind of designed around the constraints of our vehicle. I use just an exponentially, a function that just exponentially decays for how much a particular curve violates the boundaries. So we're all set up to do Bayesian inference in an algorithm that we call differential Bayesian filtering with Monte Carlo sampling. So given our mean of our initial prior, we just sample many curves, weight them according to this constraint-aware likelihood function that we've designed around the dynamic limits of the car. And then we can take the weighted sum of those curves as the new mean for our Bezier curve trajectory that the car is to follow. So the idea here being that you can actually take a Gaussian prior from a neural network and infer a more optimal curve that is both, fast and within the dynamic limits of the vehicle. And it works really well, right? So if we actually run this on track, you get much more optimal system behavior where the vehicle actually carries more speed into the curve by braking later and utilizing the full width of the track to not exceed the lateral acceleration limits of the car, such that when you come out of the curve, you're actually carrying more speed than you would without this filtering approach. So we achieve much faster lap times. We're now at around minute 26, which is pretty good. Although the pros, the actual humans who race in real life are typically somewhere between a minute 20 and a minute 26. So we still got some ways to go to catch up to the pros, but yeah, we're definitely right on the cusp of what we want to achieve. And some future work would include applying this to more multi-agent situations where it's not just the single agent vehicle on the track, but you actually have to do things like generate feasible paths for overtaking, which is nice because for this Bezier curve representation, which again is just Bernstein polynomials, there's actually a provably optimal solution for what curve will successfully overtake the other car while still minimizing the deviation from the optimal race line that you're trying to follow. That's kind of some ongoing work that isn't quite ready to publish yet, but we're getting pretty close. We could also adapt a more physics-based model to this rather than the kinematic model that we've presented here. And finally, what we really want to do is actually run this on full-scale Indy autonomous car, which is something my lab actually has. We ran this in the Indy Autonomous Challenge back in Indianapolis, Indiana, a few years ago, where we're not just doing this in simulation, right? Like we have a full-scale Indy car that we're ready to deploy, right? So that's kind of the ultimate test, right? Like it doesn't get any better than actually saying, yep, we can run a race on the Indianapolis Motor Speedway with no driver in the car. And so just to quickly recap, my research is about learning to drive autonomously in high-speed racing situations where we need to push the autonomous systems to the absolute limits of what they're capable of, because that's the only way we can really find out where they fail, right? As long as you can get pretty much anything to work as long as you stay within very, very tight, no more than 9 miles an hour type bounds, right? What I want to do is say, okay, how do we push these things as far as they can go, find out where they fail, and then fix the problems that made them fail. And we do that by developing autonomous systems that are capable of racing against each other, where edge conditions happen all the time. So I want to give a special thanks, of course, to the Metro Washington chapter of the ARCS Foundation and to the McNichols family who funded my award. It really means a lot, not just the financial support, which is of course appreciated, but the opportunity to network with other ARCS scholars and to be part of a large nationwide community of people who are looking into these kinds of problems. That really means a lot. So that's it for me. Looks like I'm 5 minutes under time. So I didn't take the full 20 minutes, but I'm happy to take questions once Eddie is done with his talk. So thanks for listening.
Trent, thank you so much. Very interesting. Now we will hear from Eddie.
Yeah. Sure.
All right, let me get prepared here. See if I can share my screen, all that good stuff. Okay, can everybody see this okay?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Cool, thank you. All right, so my name's Edward Andert, or I go by Eddie, and today I'm going to present like a short presentation on why the Silicon Valley model of move fast and break things is kind of a terrible model for autonomous vehicles. So first, a little bit of introduction about me. I'm Edward Andert. I go by Eddie usually. I'm a fourth-year PhD student at Arizona State University, and I'm obviously an ARCS scholar. I work on self-driving cars, not full-size ones, and I actually crash them purposefully so that we don't crash them on the actual road system. So you can see this video in the top right of a nice compilation of me crashing these scale models of autonomous vehicles in a lab at Arizona State. So I wanted to go a little bit of background of how I ended up in autonomous vehicles in the first place. It was a bit of an accident, but I guess the good kind of accident. And I did a senior design project in my undergrad, and we ended up trying to start a company over it, where we made a little toy robot. In the right side, you can actually see what our robot looked like. And in the bottom left, you can see what the company that decided to steal our idea actually made and successfully did as a company. So unfortunately, my foray into a startup world resulted in getting what I called Zuckerberg, if you've ever seen the Facebook movie. So unfortunately, that didn't work out, but I ended up creating a class around this car. And I actually still use a very similar platform to this robot today to do research. So you can see in the right side, that's the original version of it that was used for a class at Arizona State. And in the bottom left is the robots actually driving and not hitting each other in these videos. So the actual outcome we wanted when we drive these around. So I actually took a little bit of a break between my undergrad or my master's degree and my PhD. So I went and worked for Intel for a while, and eventually Intel acquired Mobileye, so I worked for them as well. In the bottom right, you can actually see an autonomous car that was driven on stage at the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas with the CEO of Mobileye and the CEO of Intel standing there. I programmed that car. So that's, I guess, my claim to fame working at Intel is I programmed the car that drove across the stage of CES and did not drive into the crowd of hundreds of people behind that are right in front of where these guys are standing. Why did I go back to get a PhD? I'm still not sure always to this day about exactly why I did it, but the main reason was because I saw a lot of problems at Mobileye and Intel that I couldn't fix from within a company. Some of these things were like sensor problems, calibration errors, things that caused our cars to narrowly avoid crashes a lot. And so I decided I wanted to go back to get a PhD to do research on this to actually fix these problems through cooperation between multiple autonomous vehicles. So the autonomous dream, I guess the dream of what we all want to see is, you can see, and this is a fake video on the right, but you can see that these cars are just barreling through an intersection, magically not hitting any pedestrians or each other. So you basically are driving on a freeway at all times, but it's like 100% safe. And that's like obviously the dream of autonomous vehicles, but spoiler alert, we're kind of nowhere near that right now. So before I get into my actual presentation, I wanted to thank the ARCS Foundation and my donors. So Christine and Daryl Burton, thanks for the sponsorship. And you can see in the bottom, I guess a lot of this money right now is going to pay for the medical bills for a little one who's on the way early next year. So I just wanted to give a quick thanks to the ARCS Foundation for all that you do. Okay, so into my actual presentation today. I am going to discuss 3 high-profile autonomous vehicle crashes that I believe were completely preventable, and what we learned from each of these crashes, and why maybe these crashes shouldn't have happened at all in the first place. So there was, in 2016, the first known crash of an autonomous, in quotation marks, vehicle was a Tesla Model S, and the driver unfortunately perished. In 2018, an Uber actually struck a pedestrian and killed that pedestrian right next to where I work at ASU in Tempe, like literally walking distance from the building I work at. And in 2022, Too Simple, an autonomous semi-truck company, ran into a median. Didn't kill anybody, thankfully, didn't really hurt anybody, but it drove their stock price, like it quartered it, if not worse. So I'm going to discuss these three cases and what we should have known before we even got into these cases in the first place and what we've learned from them. So the first known autonomous vehicle crash was a Tesla Model S in 2016. I'm putting autonomous vehicle in quotation marks here because it really was just lane keeping assistance and adaptive cruise control running, which isn't like fully autonomous, but it is kind of the first recorded crash that resulted in a death. So basically, the Tesla Model S is driving on autopilot. The driver is, I think, either asleep at the wheel or watching a movie. A semi-truck takes a left turn in front of this Model S, and the car drives straight under the trailer of the truck, takes the top of the car off, right? And obviously, driver does not live. The car keeps going for quite some time and hits a bunch of things. Of course, the official blame is that the driver should have stopped and they were not paying attention. My blame from this incident is actually 50% on Mobileye and their marketing department, and 50% on Tesla's engineering department or teams. And so I'll talk a little bit about why Mobileye even comes in here and why this wasn't just completely Tesla's fault. So Tesla was using a camera system that they purchased from a different company called Mobileye. As I mentioned earlier, I happened to work for Mobileye for some time, so I'm quite familiar with some of these camera systems that they created. And they basically were sold this, Tesla was sold this camera system as being able to detect all vehicles. So kind of in the bottom, I have what looks like the expectation, where you have like a semi-truck. It's a little bit blurry because I pulled this out of a video. You have a semi-truck and you can see that we have these like boxes around the entire length of the truck, right? Saying that like the camera can indeed see the entire truck and it knows it's there. But we have something more akin to what the reality was in real life from this Mobileye IQ3 camera in the bottom right side. The reality is that the camera could not recognize the tractor trailer. So meaning the actual thing that this is towing. All it could recognize was the semi-truck itself, which means you can see my little red arrow here, that according to the camera, the car could just drive right through that. And so so basically the trailer is completely missed by the software. And I place some of the blame on this to Mobileye's marketing department. Basically, they sold Tesla a camera. They said that it could detect all vehicles, and they did not. They didn't mention that it didn't 3D bounding box the side of this truck, and that basically, so Tesla was sold something that they thought worked, but really didn't work in all cases. So this goes back to the corner cases that Trent was presenting on before, but also I think this is really a marketing failure because obviously you shouldn't lie about what your product can actually do. So 50% of this, though, I also believe was Tesla's fault. And why is this? Tesla had an additional sensor on the vehicle. There is a radar underneath the front bumper of the Model S. You can see here highlighted in red. It's pretty small, but the radar should provide a redundant output for this camera. So in essence, Tesla should not have been trusting the camera 100% and should have also been looking at the radar to see if there was something according to the radar as well. So there probably should have been some testing to see if this worked, you know, that like the camera and the radar, if they disagreed, what happened, you know, do you still stop? And another thing that could have been an active question too was how was the radar programmed? Did it see this trailer as an obstacle, or was the trailer actually like too tall that the radar saw it again as free space and somewhere it could drive? I don't know the answers to any of these questions, but the point is Tesla also failed and was 50% responsible for this crash, in my opinion, as well. So, so in the end, what was the punishment for these two companies, or the move fast, break things punishment for both Tesla and Mobileye? You can see in the bottom right, this is the result of the crash, where the driver obviously did not make it through that. So there was a lot of things that happened after this incident. The first thing is the driver passes away and is of course officially blamed for the crash. Shortly afterward, Tesla breaks up with Mobileye. They basically decide that they're not going to use Mobileye as a camera manufacturer anymore because of this incident. Mobileye, meanwhile, wipes out all documentation related to the IQ3 system that was from pre-2016. If you search on Google, you cannot find any marketing material prior to this crash. And I believe it's because Mobileye was scrubbing away all the instances where they said that this camera could do these things that it then was proven that it couldn't. Mobileye never speaks of the incident again. I could not even get employees to talk about it when I worked with the company. And Tesla decides to build their own solution. So in the end, Tesla is quite successful now. So Tesla really didn't suffer very much for this. They seem to be the only autonomous vehicle company that can get away with crashes and still and keep going. But Mobileye basically loses out on the sales of over, I think since 2016, Tesla has manufactured over 3 million vehicles. So Mobileye lost out on all of those sales because Tesla decided to go with their own solution. In irony, Intel buys Mobileye 1 year later for $15 billion. So Mobileye really doesn't get punished either for this. So both these companies kind of walk away unscathed from this first ever autonomous vehicle crash that resulted in a death. So our next incident that I'd like to talk about is when Uber strikes and kills a pedestrian in 2018. So let's go over what happened during this incident. So Uber is driving autonomous vehicles all around Tempe, Arizona, which is right around Arizona State University, which is where I happen to sit now. And right up the street, and so all these vehicles are driving around with safety drivers involved, meaning that they're theoretically the autonomous system is checking and the safety driver is supposed to be paying attention. But however, in the middle of the night, the safety driver was watching a movie in one of these cars, and the vehicle ends up striking a pedestrian who's crossing the street with a bicycle. You can see here the video the screenshot that was pulled from the video of what the car sees in front of it and what the safety driver is doing as the vehicle unfortunately hits this, right before this vehicle hits this pedestrian. So you can see that the pedestrian's walking a bicycle across the street. Not something you'd expect to be uncommon, and it is at nighttime. The pedestrian is unfortunately killed, and the official blame is laid, of course, on the safety driver because they were supposed to stop. My blame, though, and in fact, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration's blame ends up being levied on Uber 100% after the fact. So let's go through this scenario a little bit and talk about what went wrong and why Uber is to blame. So this is a three-parter. Unfortunately, there's a lot of description to go through here. In the bottom right here, you can actually see a picture of an Uber, not the one that hit this pedestrian, that had crashed a couple months earlier. It had been hit by another vehicle and it had rolled over. But the point is, Uber had kind of had a record for getting in traffic incidences all around Tempe before this happened. So the first thing that's to note, it's likely that their safety driver was told that the product was perfect. And this safety driver probably assumed they could watch movies because they were so bored. And the car, of course, is perfect. So what could go wrong doing this? I blame, whatever marketing department or whoever told them this for that to some extent. But it's important to note that Uber had a kind of a record for crashes in Tempe. And this was kind of due to the fact that Uber had been having problems with their occupants in their cars had been complaining about how jerky the rides were because the cars had been seeing a lot of false positives, meaning like a balloon floats across the road and the car decides to slam on the brakes for that. A human wouldn't have done it, but the autonomous car does because it doesn't know it's a balloon. So Uber had been dialing back its safeguards slowly to stop customer complaints. Meaning that they were basically dialing back their safety in order to make their customers more happy when they're sitting in the car. And this is kind of the start of the problem. All right, so the second part. So we're going to quickly talk about what exactly happens as the vehicle is coming, or as this crash happens. So Uber, of course, claims it was very dark and their sensors couldn't see the pedestrian for the crash, right? The NHTSA ends up doing an investigation of the crash and releases a 66-page long report detailing the findings. And this report is incredibly interesting to somebody like me, but I'm going to summarize it pretty quickly for everyone else because it is a pretty dense read. So basically, the first thing to note is that Uber had disabled Volvo's safety systems, which would have braked to avoid the crash. And this is fairly standard practice for autonomous vehicle companies. We did the same thing at Mobileye and Intel because you didn't want the vehicle to just randomly brake without you knowing why. So 5.6 seconds prior to the crash, the radar senses the pedestrian as a vehicle. 5.2 seconds prior to the crash, the LiDAR senses the pedestrian as a vehicle. So Uber's claim that it was dark and the sensors couldn't see this person is already proven wrong almost immediately the minute NHTSA investigates this. 2.5 seconds before the crash, motion prediction predicts that the trajectory might result in a crash. But for some reason, that is ignored. And at this point, the car is going 40 miles an hour. So 2.5 seconds would be just fine for stopping. 1.2 seconds prior to the crash, the software predicts that basically that it's a pedestrian and it's in the path of the car. And for some reason, the vehicle ignores this. So that they have an active prediction that there's going to be a crash 1.2 seconds prior to it, and the vehicle ignores it. And at 0.2 seconds prior to the crash, the vehicle finally begins emergency braking. It stops ignoring the event and starts braking. By this point, it is far too late. The pedestrian is killed. So what happened? Like, why was this ignored? So this is really interesting and something that the NHTSA was able to find out by doing a lot of testing. So they actually took some of they forcibly took some of the vehicles from Uber after the crash had happened, and they made Uber not change the software, and they ran them in the same scenario to try to figure out what went down. So after tons and tons of investigation, the NHTSA figures out that Uber is suppressing pedestrian warnings that are not in crosswalks, which is not something a human driver would ever do. And I believe this was probably due to Uber trying to make their ride more comfortable, because their assumption was that for some reason a pedestrian will always be in a crosswalk, so that they had less false positives when they're driving down a road like this. And so, for instance, if this pedestrian had been walking along the side of the road and the Uber had slowed down for some reason, that would make their occupants a little bit like frustrated. So they had completely eliminated the feature that the car will slow down for pedestrians at all unless the pedestrian is detected in a crosswalk, which is crazy. So, and even from the camera perspective, the pedestrian is visible. So 2 seconds before the crash, the camera actually saw the pedestrian as well. So Uber's claim that it was too dark was completely false. I've driven down this road tons of times. It is not a dark road. There are traffic. There are plenty of street lights. You can almost see them in this video or in this picture here. So what was the move fast, break things punishment for Uber? So Uber is immediately banned from operating all autonomous vehicles on Arizona roadways, which I think was a proper response from the governor. Uber ends up folding its whole autonomous division shortly after the incident, which I think was a good thing that Uber did, because they had a record for this kind of stuff. The safety driver is, of course, still officially blamed for the accident, but Uber does end up paying some unknown sum to the family members of the woman who was killed. So at the same time, I was working at Intel and Mobileye, and I found a suspicious design decision in one of the most popular autonomous vehicle softwares, open source softwares out there. It's called AutoWare. And in fact, this crosswalk, this problem where pedestrians are only or pedestrians are ignored outside of a crosswalk is actually a feature programmed into AutoWare itself. And AutoWare was the basis software that a lot of these startups used to get going with their autonomous vehicle programs. So I kind of wonder how much of this was that Uber took this software suite, modified it, but didn't really comb through it and look to see all the features of it. And Yeah, it's been a while since I've worked at Intel, and I'm no longer under an NDA. I actually fixed this same exact bug in Intel's code base in 2018 after this incident happened. So Uber wasn't the only one running this bug. And so anyways, this was kind of a major find. So I just wonder whether Uber had used AutoWare as their software basis after finding that bug in AutoWare. But yeah, so Uber has no more autonomous vehicle wing. They are still alive as a company, but they do not make autonomous cars anymore. So the punishment was a lot more severe than for Tesla. All right, on to our final case. This one's a bit faster. I think I'm getting near the end of my time here. I want to talk about the most recent and high-profile autonomous crash that has happened, and it was in this year in 2022 in April. So what is happening in this is that TuSimple is an autonomous truck company, the biggest one on the market right now. They had quite a good initial IPO, and they were worth quite a bit of money before this incident happened. They're driving down the I-10 freeway in Arizona. It seems like there's a real Arizona theme to these crashes today. So the autonomous operator does what they call engaging the autonomous drive mode while they're driving down the freeway. And immediately after engaging the autonomous system, the truck turns the wheels as hard left as possible. You can see here in this GIF on the right side of here, this is actually a view of what's happening inside the cabin, as well as what the front camera of the truck sees. And you can see they narrowly missed another truck right there. And the median really saves this incident from being more severe than it could have been. But you can see that the driver and the operator here are obviously completely shocked at what happens. They weren't expecting it, and the driver tries to save it, but can't because the truck is already moving too far that way. So who is blamed? Of course, per TuSimple, they claim that a person in the cab hadn't properly rebooted the autonomous driving system before engaging it, causing it to execute an outdated command. My blame on this, 100% TuSimple's fault. And I will go through why that is in the next slide. So at this point, this is like, we've seen a lot of autonomous vehicle crashes, and the market is a lot further along. So it's actually surprising to see TuSimple make such a simple mistake in this crash. So real quickly, what happened in summary, TuSimple allowed a 2.5-minute old command to be executed. A safe autonomous vehicle company won't allow a command to be executed that's more than 0.05 seconds old, ideally. The second thing that TuSimple did wrong, they allowed an incredibly sharp turn at highway speeds that they should have known was outside of the vehicle dynamics range. Again, from Trent's presentation, modeling how the vehicle operates is really, or the bounds of how the vehicle operates is really important. They should not have allowed that command to be executed because of how sharp the turn was and how fast the vehicle was going. So a second thing they did wrong. A third thing they did wrong, the fact that the autonomous vehicle needed to be rebooted on the highway to make sure it was safe, that's wild to me. That doesn't make any sense. And if it's something that needs to be done, why didn't they have some sort of prevention mechanism to make sure that you don't need to or that the system would prevent you from re-engaging it if it hadn't been rebooted properly? And so I accidentally wrote, yeah. And so TuSimple basically did three things wrong here, three checks wrong that any safe vehicle company would have done. And so it begs the question, like, what was TuSimple doing that they missed three simple checks that almost every autonomous vehicle company does at this point? So this was a kind of a wild incident, being that like this is some simple stuff that you wouldn't expect to happen, 6 years after the first ever autonomous vehicle crash that results in a death. So what was the move fast, break things punishment for TuSimple? TuSimple stock plummets from about $12 a share to around $2.50 a share. I think today it's at $2.25. You can see down here that there's like kind of a red arrow indicating where the event happened. At one point, TuSimple stock was worth $62 a share, and now it's worth $2.25 a share. So you can see that the market, that investors don't like crashes anymore. So they were pretty punished by this. Too Simple is still operating since no one was officially hurt and there is no damage other than like the guardrail being scraped and obviously Too Simple's truck. Most of it's just pride and stock price damages. But Too Simple seems to be quite punished in terms of stock price. So I just got through talking about all these companies that have these terrible records and did these bad crashes. But I did want to take a brief moment before I finish off here to say that there are some good companies out here. Waymo, who operates in Arizona and also in San Francisco, does have a pretty stellar record of not causing crashes and has obviously not killed anybody, despite the fact that they have like something over 1 million miles on the actual road. And I think that's pretty impressive. And it does show that if safety is in the company culture, it is possible to not make these kind of mistakes. There was an interesting case where a Waymo did kind of run away from its handlers when it was kind of braking. It was a couple months ago. It was kind of funny to watch this video. Basically, the technicians trying to shut down the vehicle, and the vehicle keeps like driving away from them. So that was just kind of funny, though nobody was hurt. The vehicle obviously got confused a lot by some of these scenarios that happens, like why is there a truck driving down the road the wrong way and a bunch of other stuff. So in conclusion, I think move fast and break things is a fine plan for software, but it's really not so good when you're driving a heavy vehicle around and human lives are involved. You know, it's a very big deal that we need to think about safety at all points when we're designing these autonomous vehicles. We need to be very precise about our sensing and object prediction. And then I think test, and test some more is my motto. The more testing you do, the less likely something like this will happen on the real road. And you might not be punished by the law, but your company will probably fold or be worth a lot less, unless, of course, you're Tesla and Mobileye. Somehow they completely dodged the bullet. But Uber basically folded their autonomous vehicle into wing, and Too Simple, you know, is now valued at like 1/50th of their original valuation. So bad stuff can happen to companies, even if the law doesn't punish you. And that's it for me. So I think I'll go ahead and stop sharing because I think we're going to do a Q&A session.
Yes, Eddie, thank you so much for that very interesting presentation and all the examples you've provided. We have some questions from the chat. Let's try to take a few before we close out. The first one is, Trent, are you working with pro drivers?
Yes and no. So for the Indy Autonomous Challenge, we actually did have some consultation sessions with real Indy Light drivers, kind of describing, you know, their high level approach for, you know, what's their thought process when they're you know, taking these very high speed maneuvers. But there wasn't really any kind of detailed, you know, technical meetings with them, which is unfortunate because that's what we really need. And the challenge is that these companies, well, I say companies, these race teams, which are, you know, independent companies, are very, very tight-lipped about kind of the more technical data and strategies they employ, right? They don't want to share anything that would give away their competitive advantage. So working with actual pro drivers from real race teams is doable, but kind of challenging from an information protection standpoint. And you know, kind of the other part of your question, do they see this modeling as useful to their work? Not yet. The kind of racing scenarios we're doing on real cars are still somewhat contrived. So the Indy Autonomous Challenge is still only doing head-to-head racing. We're not yet at the level where we can do, you know, full-on 20 cars on track, and that's the kind of situation they're looking for. So we do work with pro drivers, but not as much as I'd really like to.
Eddie, thank you, Trent. Eddie, we have a question for you. Quite a few questions actually about criminal liability. Trent asked, how do you foresee criminal liability for these companies? And another question was, how do you see criminal charges coming out of these events?
Yeah, that's a it's a sticky question because you know, that it brings up the big R word, regulations, right? And at this point right now, there really is no regulations for autonomous vehicles at all. California is really the only state that has any sort of thing, and all they measure is something called disengagement, which just means every time the safety driver has to take over, they count up +1, which doesn't really mean anything in the real in the sense of real crashes, right? Yeah, I guess in the future, I think this will get more and more blamed on companies. So Mercedes very recently said that their new car, they are going to fully take responsibility for all crashes that it gets into. And this is their what they call level 4 autonomy system that they're supposed to be coming out with in the next 2 years. And I think this is a really amazing step that a company has said, that we will take liability for the crashes you get in when you're driving with our system. And so I really hope to see that this trend starts to take off in a lot of companies. So far, Tesla is completely the opposite. It's completely your fault if you get in a crash, even though they'll tell you that their car drives perfectly. So I'm really glad to see Mercedes doing this. I don't know if the US will ever start regulating these kind of things. I don't know when that will happen. But yeah, at this point, though, blame is still on the drivers. But I think with Mercedes making this change, a lot of other manufacturers might follow suit in the future in order to gain customer trust. And that's the thing I like to see, is that a company is willing to put their neck on the line in this way, to show their customers that they're confident in their product.
Okay. Trent, we have a couple questions for you. How do moisture and other cars on the track affect your results?
Yeah. So as for moisture, it kind of depends on the racing situation, right? So for races like the Indy 500 that are in very, very high speed oval tracks, where the drives are basically flat out, accelerator all the way down the whole way, you just wouldn't run the race. Right. If the track is even slightly wet, or if it even looks like it's going to rain, they just delay the race. You just don't do it. Whereas in situations like Formula One, where they typically run road circuits, where you race even if it's pouring down rain, it just changes your dynamic limits, right? So, for my most recent results, we just used some linear interpolation on data we collected in the simulator. On a kind of a dry sunny day, which is kind of the classic sunny day scenario for autonomous vehicles, right? But if the track is wet, of course, the amount of lateral acceleration you can tolerate before the tires slip goes way down, right? So it's not necessarily a problem as long as you can accurately model how much a wet track changes the kinematic and dynamic limits of your vehicle. And other agents. That's what I'm actively researching right now, which is just another probabilistic constraints in the Bayesian model, right? So instead of just track bounds and dynamic limits, now you also have a collision avoidance constraint that you would have to tack onto the Bayesian estimation framework. And that there's some results on that are forthcoming, not quite ready for publication, but the same methodology seems to work as long as you can accurately predict the motion of the other cars.
Thank you. And I think we have time for one more question for both of you. If the timing works on that. Where do you see autonomous vehicles being in the next 5 to 10 years? Each of you, please answer.
5 to 10 years. I think we'll see autonomous vehicles driving on the highway, where you can actually, hop in the back seat, go to sleep, as long as you're exclusively driving in very controlled, very structured environments like an interstate highway. Both in racing and in kind of the stuff Eddie was talking about, where stuff tends to break down is when pedestrians are involved, or in urban environments where traffic flow is much more complex. That's a much more difficult problem. I don't foresee that being solved in the next 5 to 10 years, but Eddie is free to disagree with me on that.
Yeah, I think honestly, I kind of echo what Trent is saying. Like as far as consumers go in our own vehicles, I think the freeway situation is on its way to being well solved, and probably in 5 to 10 years, yeah, you'll be sleeping in the back of your car. But the minute you get off the freeway, the car is going to be like, hey, I need you to become awake again because I don't know what's going on in this strange rural road, you know? So like well mapped freeways will probably be, yeah, a pretty low hanging fruit for the autonomous vehicle industry. I also see like slow speed driving as a case where adoption will happen a lot more rapidly as well, like under 25 miles an hour, like driving around, you know, a college campus or something where like it's kind of controlled in private roads, and a lot in like shipping yards and stuff like that. So areas where like it's not a public road and it's not these like 45-mile-an-hour traffic lights, because I think that's like one of the hardest places to drive autonomously. Waymo seems to be well on its way to doing that, but they spend a lot of time mapping the city and looking for corner cases and all that. So like we may see some companies do it, but I think the vast majority of companies will shy away from your typical like city driving because it is just so hard to predict like what's going to fly into the road at any time. But yeah, definitely highway driving, I think, is something we will see.
Well, I'd like to say thank you so much to both of you for being part of today's program. We received many comments in chat how great your presentations were, so thank you. Your work's impressive, and we appreciate you giving back to ARCS by sharing your research and career highlights with us today. As you can see, ARCS Foundation makes a real impact in the lives of up-and-coming scientists. Please consider a year-end gift for everyone on the viewing today. A donation link is on the arcsfoundation.org website. Thank you all for participating in this session. We will send out a link to the recording for you to share. You will also receive a short survey. Please let us know if there is a topic of interest to you. We really do use the survey info to design our sessions, so please return them. The next ARCS Forward event will be February 16th, 2023 at noon Eastern Time. Please mark your calendars for it. The topic is congenital heart disease and will feature Omar Tubat from ARCS Los Angeles and Stephanie Hellman from ARCS Pittsburgh. Thank you all for attending. We look forward to seeing you after the first of the year.